The brass casings caught the afternoon light like scattered coins as Captain Indira Ghost Malhotra swept them into neat piles. The indoor range at Bagram Airfield hummed with the familiar silence that only came after hours of sustained fire. She moved methodically, her weathered hands working the push broom with the same precision she once used on stick and throttle. Most pilots avoided range duty, but Ghost volunteered for it. The repetitive motion helped quiet the voices that still echoed in her head from Kandahar. The digital clock above lane 12 read 15:47 hours. In 13 minutes, the evening shift would arrive, and she could return to her quarters where a bottle of Jameson waited behind her flight manuals. 3 years since her last combat mission. 3 years since they grounded her permanently for psychological unfitness for flight status. The brass never said it directly, but she knew. Post-traumatic stress was a career killer in military aviation, especially for someone who'd already fought tooth and nail for every opportunity in a male-dominated field. A metallic scrape echoed from the armory door behind her. Ghost didn't turn around, probably just Sergeant Martinez checking inventory before his shift ended. She'd worked enough range details to know the routine, but something felt different about the sound, urgent, purposeful. The kind of movement that preceded bad news. "Ma'am." The voice belonged to Chief Petty Officer Marcus Volkov, a Navy SEAL she'd seen around the base but never spoken to directly. When she turned, his expression made her stomach drop. No jokes, no casual military banter. His eyes held the focused intensity she remembered from pre-flight briefings before the worst missions. "Jifa." He was already moving toward the weapons locker, his fingers working the electronic lock with practiced speed. Base alarms about to sound. Hostile forces, inbound, 15 clicks out. His voice carried the calm authority of someone who delivered similar news countless times. "We've got maybe 10 minutes before they hit the perimeter." Ghost's training kicked in before her conscious mind could process the implications. Her body remembered what her official status had forced her to forget. How many? Unknown, but they took out the northern watchtower 6 minutes ago. Volkov pulled an M4A1 from the rack, checked the action with mechanical efficiency, then extended it toward her. "You still remember how to fight, Captain." The weight of the rifle felt like coming home. Ghost's hands found their familiar positions without conscious thought, muscle memory, overriding 3 years of administrative desk work. Through the small window, she could see personnel running across the compound with the organized urgency that preceded combat. The sky above the mountains had turned the color of old blood. The range's fluorescent lights flickered once, then died. Emergency power kicked in a moment later, bathing everything in harsh red light. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the distinctive whine of incoming mortars. The war had found them again. The base alarm split the air like a chainsaw through silk. Ghost's ears had grown accustomed to the relative quiet of administrative duty, but that sound, that god-awful mechanical shriek, brought everything flooding back. Her hands tightened on the M4's grip as Volkov moved to the ammunition storage, his movements economical and urgent. "How'd they get this close without detection?" Ghost asked, checking her weapons safety while scanning the room for additional magazines. Her voice carried steady authority despite 3 years away from combat operations. Some instincts never died, they just hibernated. "Someone's been planning this for months." Volkov tossed her a tactical vest loaded with spare ammunition. "They hit our outer sensors first, then the communication relays. Professional work." He paused at the range's reinforced door, pressing his ear against the steel. This wasn't some Taliban patrol that got lucky. Ghost slipped into the vest with practiced efficiency, her fingers automatically checking each magazine's seating. The familiar weight distribution felt like putting on an old uniform that still fit perfectly. "What's our current defensive posture?" "Skeleton crew, half the air wings on rotation, most of the infantry's running training exercises 20 clicks south." Volkov's jaw tightened. Whoever planned this knew exactly when we'd be most vulnerable. Through the range's small windows, Ghost could see muzzle flashes in the distance. Not random spray and pray, but disciplined, coordinated fire. These weren't desperate fighters throwing everything at American positions. This was something else entirely. "Movement, 3 o'clock," Volkov whispered, pointing toward the motor pool. Ghost followed his gaze and saw figures moving between the parked vehicles with military precision. They wore no identifying markers, carried weapons that looked suspiciously like stolen American hardware, and moved like soldiers who'd done this before. "Mercenaries?" she asked. "Or worse." Volkov checked his sidearm, a worn Sig Sauer that looked like it had seen multiple deployments. Intel's been tracking increased foreign operator activity in the region. Russian contractors, Chinese advisors, Iranian Quds Force. Take your pick. Ghost felt her pulse slow to combat rhythm, that familiar calm that had carried her through 47 combat missions over Afghanistan and Iraq. Her official flight status might have been revoked, but her warrior instincts remained sharp. "What's the plan, Chief?" "Survive until reinforcements arrive." He moved to the range's secondary exit, a maintenance door that opened onto the flight line. "Command's trying to scramble response teams, but the enemy's been jamming our communications. We're on our own until someone figures out how to punch through their electronic warfare." The sound of automatic weapons fire grew closer. Ghost could distinguish between different weapon systems now: AK-47s, American M4s, something that sounded like a Soviet-era PKM machine gun. Mixed hardware suggested either a very well-supplied insurgent group or multiple foreign actors working together. "Ghost," Volkov said quietly, "whatever they grounded you for, I need you to forget about it for the next few hours." She met his eyes. In them, she saw something she hadn't encountered in 3 years: complete professional respect. Not pity for her psychological evaluation failures, not awkwardness about her mental health struggles, just recognition of her capabilities as a warrior. "Already forgotten, Chief." The maintenance door opened onto chaos. Bagram's flight line stretched before them like an industrial graveyard under attack. 3 F-16 Fighting Falcons sat in their revetments, their gray camouflage paint schemes almost invisible in the emergency lighting's red glow. Between the aircraft, Ghost could see muzzle flashes and the distinctive spark showers of ricocheting bullets. Volkov held up a closed fist, freezing Ghost in place. 50 meters away, 2 figures in mismatched combat gear were attempting to plant charges on one of the fighters. Their movements suggested professional military training. They worked with the kind of silent coordination that came from extensive practice. "Sabotage team," Ghost whispered. "They're trying to destroy our air assets." "Can't let that happen." Volkov's voice carried the weight of someone who'd made similar calculations countless times. "Those birds might be our only chance of calling in effective air support." Ghost studied the tactical situation with the analytical mind that had made her one of the Air Force's most effective close air support pilots. The saboteurs had positioned themselves behind the aircraft's landing gear, using the F-16's bulk as cover from the main base. But they'd left themselves exposed to flanking fire from the maintenance hangar's eastern approach. "I can get an angle from the tool crib," she said, indicating a low concrete building adjacent to the flight line. "Give me 90 seconds to get into position, then create a distraction." Volkov nodded. "What kind of distraction?" "The loud kind." Ghost moved with the fluid grace that had made her call sign stick during flight training. Ghost hadn't been chosen for her personality. It reflected her ability to appear anywhere on the battlefield without warning. She'd perfected the skill during countless ground operations in Iraq, learning to move through urban environments like smoke through ventilation systems. The tool crib's metal door had been propped open by someone's hasty evacuation. Ghost slipped inside and found herself surrounded by aircraft maintenance equipment that looked like surgical instruments designed by engineers with anger management issues. Hydraulic jacks, engine hoists, and diagnostic computers worth more than most people's houses. Through the building's far window, she had a perfect sight line to the saboteurs. Both men wore night vision goggles despite the emergency lighting, suggesting they'd planned to operate in complete darkness. Their explosive charges looked sophisticated, military-grade shaped charges designed to destroy aircraft engines beyond repair. Ghost's radio crackled with static, then Volkov's voice. "Ghost, be advised, I've got movement all around the flight line. This is bigger than two guys with bombs." She keyed her microphone twice to acknowledge, then settled into a shooting position behind a workbench that would provide both cover and stability. The M4's ACOG sight picture came into focus, and she felt muscle memory taking over. Breath control, trigger discipline, target identification, skills that transcended the distinction between air and ground combat. One of the saboteurs looked up from his work, scanning the surrounding buildings with professional paranoia. His face was Middle Eastern, but his equipment and methodology screamed European training. Probably former special forces working for whatever organization had bankrolled this operation. Ghost crosshairs found center mass. The first shot echoed across the flight line like a thunderclap in a cathedral. Ghost's target dropped instantly, his shaped charge clattering onto the concrete with a metallic ring that spoke of serious explosive potential. The second saboteur spun toward the muzzle flash, his own weapon tracking with trained precision, but Ghost had already shifted position. Volkov's distraction came in the form of sustained automatic fire from the hangar's main entrance. The SEAL had found something belt-fed, probably a crew-served weapon from one of the destroyed guard positions, and was laying down suppressive fire across the entire flight line approach. Tracer rounds painted red lines through the darkness, and the sound was absolutely magnificent. Ghost used the covering fire to sprint between aircraft revetments. Her boots found their rhythm on familiar concrete, and for the first time in 3 years, she felt like she was exactly where she belonged. Not behind a desk reviewing training schedules or processing supply requests, but in the middle of a tactical situation that required split-second decisions and precise execution. "Ghost, how copy?" Volkov's voice crackled through her radio. "One down, one displaced," she replied, sliding into position behind an F-16's nose gear. "But Chief, we've got bigger problems." Through the aircraft's landing lights, she could see at least a dozen figures moving toward their position with military precision. They weren't wearing standard insurgent gear. These men carried modern weapons, wore matching tactical vests, and moved with the coordinated discipline of professional soldiers. "I count 12, possibly 15 hostiles," Ghost continued, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were facing. "Mixed equipment but high-end gear. Whoever's funding this operation has serious resources." "Copy that." Volkov's response carried the calm acceptance of someone who'd faced impossible odds before. "I've got movement on the eastern perimeter too. Looks like we're surrounded." Ghost felt her tactical mind shifting into higher gear. 2 American service members against at least 25 professional operators, no air support, limited ammunition, and no immediate prospect of reinforcement. In any rational analysis, this was a suicide mission. But Ghost had never been particularly rational. She keyed her radio again. "Chief, what's your assessment of those F-16s? Any chance they're mission capable?" "Negative. They're down for scheduled maintenance. No fuel, no ordnance, probably no functional avionics." "What about the A-10 in Hangar 3? Long pause. "Ghost, even if it were flyable, you're grounded permanently." She moved to a new firing position, using the aircraft's wing as cover while she scanned for targets. "My psychological evaluation doesn't matter much if we're both dead in the next 10 minutes. "Fair point." Volkov's tone shifted, becoming more tactical, less administrative. But that warthog hasn't flown in 6 months. She's been cannibalized for spare parts. Ghost smiled grimly. Chief, you'd be amazed what a motivated pilot can make airworthy in a crisis situation. The A-10 Thunderbolt II sat in Hangar 3 like a sleeping predator. Even in the emergency lighting's red glow, the aircraft radiated the brutal functionality that had made it legendary among ground forces. Its twin engines, mounted high on the fuselage, looked like metallic kidneys designed by someone who understood that beauty and lethality weren't mutually exclusive. Ghost ran her hands along the fuselage, checking for obvious structural damage while Volkov maintained security at the hangar entrance. The Warthog's titanium bathtub cockpit showed familiar wear patterns from countless combat missions. This aircraft had been to war and back multiple times. "Talk to me, beautiful," she whispered, beginning her pre-flight inspection with practiced efficiency. The external store's pylons were empty. No GAU-8 ammunition, no Maverick missiles, no bombs. But the aircraft's primary weapon was intact. The 7-barrel GAU-8 Avenger cannon that formed the plane's structural centerpiece. "Ghost, we've got movement," Volkov called from the hangar door. "Looks like they're setting up a perimeter. Professional work, overlapping fields of fire, coordinated positioning." She continued her inspection, checking control surfaces and engine intakes. The A-10 had been designed for exactly this kind of situation, operating from damaged airfields under combat conditions with minimal ground support. If any aircraft could be made flyable in 30 minutes, it was a Warthog. "Chief, I need you to find the maintenance chief's office," Ghost said, climbing onto the wing to access the cockpit. "Look for a red binder labeled Aircraft Status Board. Should tell us exactly what's been removed." "On it." Ghost settled into the familiar seat and began the emergency startup checklist from memory. The A-10's cockpit was spartanly functional. No unnecessary decoration, no comfort features, just the tools needed to deliver devastating close air support. Her hands moved across switches and controls with muscle memory that transcended her grounding. The auxiliary power unit whined to life, feeding electrical power to the aircraft's systems. Ghost felt the Warthog awakening around her like some technological dinosaur rousing from hibernation. Hydraulic systems came online with satisfying mechanical sounds, and the heads-up display flickered to life. "Found it," Volkov's voice crackled through her headset. "Says here they pulled the left engine for overhaul, removed the GAU-8 ammunition drum, and disabled the fire control computer." Ghost's hands paused over the engine start switches. One engine might be enough for a combat mission, but without ammunition for the primary weapon, the A-10 was essentially a very expensive observation platform. "What about the external pylons?" she asked. "Hang on." Paper rustled over the radio. "Two Sidewinder missiles, Station 3 and 9, but Ghost, without fire control, you can't lock targets." She smiled grimly. Air-to-air missiles against ground targets wasn't textbook tactics, but Ghost had never been particularly concerned with textbooks. During her last combat deployment, she'd used a Maverick missile to destroy a Taliban command bunker by manually guiding it into the target using visual references. "Chief, how much time do we have?" "Maybe 10 minutes before they organize a coordinated assault. These aren't amateurs. They're taking time to do this right." Ghost began the single-engine startup sequence. The right-side turbofan engine spooled up with the distinctive whine that every A-10 pilot learned to love. Fuel flow looked good, exhaust temperature within normal parameters, oil pressure steady. "One engine online," she reported, "beginning taxi in 60 seconds." They rolled out of Hangar 3 with the ponderous grace of a mechanical rhinoceros. Ghost had disabled the aircraft's external lighting to avoid giving the enemy easy targets, relying instead on night vision and memory to navigate Bagram's taxiways. The single engine provided adequate power for ground operations, though she'd have limited performance once airborne. Through her night vision goggles, the base looked like a war zone from some dystopian movie. Small fires burned throughout the compound, and she could see muzzle flashes from at least 6 different locations. The enemy had established overlapping fields of fire across all major approaches, turning Bagram into a killing field. "Ghost, be advised, I've got visual on heavy weapons," Volkov reported from his overwatch position. "Looks like they've set up mortars near the fuel depot. If they start dropping rounds on the flight line." "Understood." Ghost turned the A-10 onto the main taxiway, heading toward the runway's approach end. "Chief, I need you to create the biggest distraction you can manage, something to draw their attention away from aircraft operations." "What did you have in mind?" Ghost checked her weapons panel. 2 AIM-9 Sidewinder missiles, designed for air-to-air combat but potentially effective against ground targets in desperate circumstances. The fire control computer might be disabled, but the missile's infrared seekers could still lock onto heat sources, vehicle engines, generators, anything producing a significant thermal signature. "Can you access the base's fuel storage systems?" Long pause. "Ghost, you're not thinking about." Fuel air explosion, big enough to be seen from orbit, loud enough to wake the dead, and hot enough to overwhelm their night vision equipment. She reached the runway threshold and began her engine run-up sequence. "Plus, it might convince them we have more resources than 2 people and a broken airplane." "That's completely insane." "Chief, at this point, insane might be our only tactical advantage." Ghost advanced the throttle and felt the respond with its characteristic reluctance to leave the ground. Warthogs weren't designed for elegance. They were built for the kind of brutal effectiveness that turned desperate ground situations into manageable tactical problems. Tonight, she needed every ounce of that reputation. The aircraft broke ground with all the grace of a flying crowbar, but it was airborne. Ghost retracted the landing gear and began a climbing turn toward the base perimeter, scanning for targets through her night vision system. Below, she could see the geometric patterns of enemy positions, too organized, too professional for standard insurgent operations. "Volkov, who the hell are we fighting down there?" "Best guess, Wagner Group, Russian mercenaries with Syrian combat experience." His voice carried grim certainty. "This whole operation feels like Aleppo or Ghouta, overwhelming firepower, professional coordination, complete disregard for civilian casualties." Ghost felt ice forming in her stomach. Wagner Group didn't just fight wars, they erased opposition with industrial efficiency. At 800 feet above ground level, Ghost could see the full scope of the assault. The enemy had positioned teams at every critical infrastructure point: communications towers, fuel storage, vehicle maintenance, command centers. This wasn't a raid or harassing attack. It was systematic destruction designed to render Bagram completely non-operational. "Ghost, I've reached the fuel control station," Volkov reported. "But I need at least 5 minutes to override the safety systems. Can you buy me that time?" She banked the A-10 toward the northern perimeter, where concentrated muzzle flashes indicated the heaviest enemy presence. The aircraft's single engine was performing adequately, though she'd need to be careful about power management during combat maneuvering. "I'll give you 10 minutes," Ghost replied, selecting her first Sidewinder missile and beginning the manual targeting process. Without functional fire control computers, she'd have to guide the missile onto target using visual references and basic trigonometry. Below, a cluster of vehicles near the communications tower provided perfect heat signatures. Ghost rolled into a shallow dive, putting the A-10's nose on target, while the Sidewinder's seeker head began tracking the thermal signature of diesel engines and exhaust systems. The missile's lock-on tone filled her headset, a steady, predatory sound that meant the infrared seeker had found something it wanted to kill. Ghost waited until the targeting solution stabilized, then squeezed the trigger. The Sidewinder dropped from its pylon and immediately began tracking toward the vehicle cluster. Against air targets, the missile was designed to home in on engine heat. Against ground targets, it would simply find the hottest available signature and detonate on contact. The explosion painted the northern perimeter in brilliant white light. Two vehicles disappeared in expanding fireballs, and Ghost could see figures running from the impact zone with their clothing on fire. The psychological effect was exactly what she'd hoped for: sudden, devastating, and completely unexpected. "Nice shooting," Volkov's voice carried genuine admiration. "That definitely got their attention." Ghost was already maneuvering for her second attack, scanning for the next highest value target. The enemy's mortar position near the fuel depot presented both an opportunity and a significant risk. If she could eliminate the mortar team, she'd remove their indirect fire capability. But if her missile hit the fuel storage tanks instead of the mortars... "Chief, how's that fuel-air explosion coming?" 3 minutes. But Ghost, if you're planning to hit targets near the depot, wait until after I trigger the main event. The blast wave will be significant. She pulled the A-10 into a climbing turn, using altitude and distance to extend her observation time. Below, the enemy was responding to her first attack with professional discipline. No panic, no confusion, just tactical adaptation to a changing situation. That worried her more than panic would have. The fuel depot erupted like a miniature nuclear weapon. Volkov had somehow managed to detonate approximately 50,000 gallons of aviation fuel simultaneously, creating a mushroom cloud that rose 300 feet into the night sky and bathed the entire base in flickering orange light. Ghost felt the blast wave hit her A-10 even at altitude, rocking the aircraft with turbulence that threatened to tear the wings off. She fought to maintain control while watching the most spectacular explosion she'd ever witnessed from a cockpit. The thermal bloom was so intense it overwhelmed her night vision goggles, forcing her to rely on naked eye vision until her equipment could adjust. "Holy shit, Chief," she transmitted. "That was biblical." "Fuel systems are designed with safety margins," Volkov replied with what sounded like grim satisfaction. "Turns out those margins can work in reverse if you're creative with the override protocols." Below, the explosion had accomplished everything Ghost had hoped. The enemy positions that had been so carefully coordinated were now scattered, disorganized, and partially blinded by the massive thermal signature. More importantly, the fuel depot's destruction had created a beacon visible for miles in every direction. "Ghost, I'm picking up radio chatter on emergency frequencies," Volkov continued. "Sounds like our people are finally getting organized. Response teams from Kandahar and Jalalabad are airborne." Ghost banked toward the remaining enemy positions, her last Sidewinder missile ready for deployment. The mortar team had survived the fuel depot explosion and was now attempting to relocate their equipment. Through her targeting system, she could see them loading tubes and ammunition onto vehicles with practiced efficiency. "Not happening," she muttered, rolling into another attack dive. This time, she aimed for the center of the mortar team's new position. The infrared seeker locked onto the largest heat signature, probably the team's command vehicle, and she fired her last air-to-air missile at what was essentially a surface target. The Sidewinder tracked true, detonating directly above the mortar position and showering the area with white-hot fragmentation. The explosion eliminated both the mortar tubes and their crews, removing the enemy's primary indirect fire capability. "That's it for air-to-ground ordnance," Ghost reported. "I'm Winchester on missiles." "Copy. Can you provide observation support? I'm seeing movement near the flight line that looks like they're regrouping for another assault." Ghost pulled the A-10 into a wide orbit over Bagram, using altitude and her superior visibility to track enemy movements. Even without weapons, the Warthog could serve as an airborne command post, coordinating defensive efforts and providing real-time intelligence. Through her radio, she began hearing the familiar sounds of American military efficiency: helicopter rotors, jet engines, and the crisp professional communications that meant reinforcements were finally arriving. The battle for Bagram was far from over, but for the first time in hours, Ghost felt like they might actually survive. The first AH-64 Apache attack helicopters appeared on the horizon like mechanical angels of death. Ghost watched them approach through her aircraft's targeting system, their sleek profiles unmistakable even in the pre-dawn darkness. Behind them, she could make out the distinctive silhouette of additional aircraft, more Apache, probably some Black Hawks for troop transport, and what looked like a pair of F-16s at higher altitude. "Viper Flight, this is Ghost," she transmitted on the emergency frequency. "I have eyes on target below, can provide immediate battle damage assessment and target coordination." "Ghost, Viper Lead, understand you're the A-10 that's been engaging targets over Bagram." The Apache pilot's voice carried professional curiosity mixed with respect. "We monitored your missile strikes inbound. Impressive work with air-to-air ordnance against surface targets." Ghost felt a flush of pride that she hadn't experienced in 3 years. "Viper Lead, I count approximately 15 to 20 enemy personnel still active around the base perimeter. They've broken into smaller groups after the fuel depot explosion, but they're still organized and dangerous." "Copy that. Can you mark targets for us?" She scanned the ground through her targeting system, identifying the scattered enemy positions by their heat signatures and movement patterns. "I can provide laser designation if you've got Hellfires that can accept external guidance." "Affirmative. Stand by for coordinated engagement." What followed was the kind of textbook combined arms operation that military doctrine writers dream about. Ghost used the A-10's superior altitude and observation capabilities to identify targets, while the Apache crews provided precision firepower to eliminate them. Each engagement was quick, surgical, and devastatingly effective. Within 20 minutes, organized enemy resistance around Bagram had been completely eliminated. The few survivors had either surrendered or disappeared into the surrounding mountains, leaving behind expensive equipment and clear evidence of professional military training. "Ghost, Viper Lead," the Apache pilot transmitted. "We're showing all hostile contact eliminated. Outstanding target coordination." "Thank you, Viper Lead." Ghost began her approach to Bagram's runway, finally able to land the A-10 after nearly 2 hours of continuous operations. It felt good to be useful again. As she descended toward the airfield, Ghost could see ground crews and security teams swarming across the base. Emergency vehicles were responding to various fires and damaged sites, while teams of investigators were already examining abandoned enemy equipment. The A-10 touched down on Bagram's main runway with its characteristic heavy thump, and Ghost felt 3 years of administrative exile finally coming to an end. She'd proven something tonight, to herself, to Volkov, and to anyone who'd questioned her continued effectiveness as a military aviator. The war might have tried to break her, but it hadn't succeeded. Ghost shut down the A-10's engine and sat in the cockpit for a long moment, letting the silence wash over her. Through the canopy, she could see Chief Volkov jogging across the flight line with what looked like half the base security force behind him. Emergency vehicles continued their work in the background, but the immediate crisis had passed. Her hands were shaking slightly, adrenaline come down, nothing more. She'd experienced the same phenomenon after countless combat missions over Iraq and Afghanistan. The difference was that tonight, for the first time in 3 years, the shaking felt like accomplishment rather than trauma. The canopy opened with its familiar hydraulic whine, and Ghost began the post-flight ritual of securing switches and recording flight data. Even in combat conditions, proper documentation mattered. Some habits transcended crisis situations. Captain Malhotra, a voice called from below. Ghost looked down to see Colonel Jennifer Martinez, Bagram's current air operations commander, standing beside the A-10's crew ladder. The colonel's expression was unreadable, but her presence suggested significant command interest in the night's events. "Ma'am," Ghost replied, climbing down from the cockpit with practiced efficiency, "I can explain the unauthorized aircraft operation." "Captain, what you can do is accept my sincere gratitude for preventing a complete disaster." Colonel Martinez's tone carried genuine warmth. "Chief Volkov has briefed me on tonight's events. Your actions probably saved hundreds of lives." Ghost felt something shifting inside her chest, a loosening of tension she hadn't realized she'd been carrying for 3 years. "I was just doing my job, ma'am." "No, Captain, you were doing far more than your job." The colonel paused, choosing her words carefully. "Walk with me." They moved away from the flight line toward the base operations center, passing teams of investigators who were photographing and cataloging abandoned enemy equipment. Ghost noticed that much of the hardware looked Russian: night vision goggles, communication equipment, and weapons that definitely hadn't come from local sources. "Captain, I've been reviewing your service record," Colonel Martinez continued. 47 combat missions over Iraq and Afghanistan, Distinguished Flying Cross, multiple air medals, consistently outstanding performance evaluations. Then suddenly, 3 years ago, you were grounded for psychological reasons. Ghost's jaw tightened. "Ma'am, I experienced some difficulties adjusting to post-deployment life. The flight surgeons determined I was unfit for flight status." "The flight surgeons determined you were suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder after witnessing the destruction of a medical convoy you were supposed to protect." The colonel's voice carried no judgment, only facts. "You blamed yourself for not being able to prevent civilian casualties." They'd reached the operations center, where dozens of personnel were coordinating response efforts and damage assessment. Through the windows, Ghost could see communication equipment being rapidly repaired and fuel trucks beginning the process of establishing temporary aviation fuel supplies. "Captain," Colonel Martinez said quietly, "tonight you demonstrated exactly the kind of tactical judgment and combat effectiveness this military needs. Your psychological evaluation is hereby suspended pending complete review." The operations center hummed with controlled chaos as teams coordinated damage assessment and base recovery efforts. Ghost found herself standing in front of a large tactical display that showed the full scope of the night's attack. Red symbols marked enemy positions, blue symbols indicated friendly forces, and yellow markers showed infrastructure damage. "Wagner Group," Colonel Martinez said, pointing to photographs of captured equipment. "Russian mercenaries working on behalf of someone with serious financial resources. This wasn't some local insurgent operation. This was a full-scale attempt to eliminate Bagram as a strategic asset." Ghost studied the enemy equipment photos with professional interest. The coordination was too good for standard mercenary work. Someone with access to NATO tactical doctrine planned this assault. "My thoughts exactly." The colonel pulled up additional intelligence displays showing regional threat assessments and known Wagner Group activities. "We're dealing with adversaries who understand American military capabilities and are actively working to counter them." Chief Volkov approached their position, looking exhausted but satisfied. His tactical vest still showed scorch marks from the fuel depot explosion, and his face carried the kind of grime that came from prolonged combat operations. "Colonel Captain," he said with formal military courtesy, "initial damage assessment is complete. They destroyed approximately 60% of our fuel storage capacity, eliminated 2 communication towers, and damaged 3 aircraft beyond immediate repair. But the base remains operational." "Thanks to both of you," Colonel Martinez replied. "Chief, Your fuel depot gambit was inspired tactical thinking. Captain, your use of air-to-air missiles against ground targets was unconventional but devastatingly effective. Ghost felt a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with adrenaline. Professional recognition from competent military leaders was something she'd missed more than she'd realized during her 3 years of administrative exile. "Ma'am," she said carefully, "what happens now, with my flight status, I mean?" Colonel Martinez smiled. "Captain, as of right now, you're reinstated to full flight status pending completion of current readiness training. The psychological evaluation that grounded you will be reviewed by a board that includes combat veterans who understand the difference between post-traumatic stress and tactical incompetence." Through the operations center's windows, Ghost could see the sun beginning to rise over the Hindu Kush Mountains. The golden light painted Bagram's damaged infrastructure in shades of hope and possibility. For the first time in 3 years, she felt like she had a future in military aviation. "There's something else," the colonel continued. "I'm recommending you for immediate promotion to major and assignment as Bagram's new close air support flight leader. We need someone who understands both the tactical realities of modern warfare and the psychological pressures our pilots face in combat." Ghost's throat tightened with emotion she hadn't allowed herself to feel since her grounding. "Ma'am, thank you." "Don't thank me yet, Major. Thank me when you've trained the next generation of pilots to be half as effective as you were tonight." 2 weeks after the Wagner Group assault, Ghost stood in the doorway of Hangar 3, watching her new flight of A-10 pilots conduct pre-mission briefings. The aircraft had been fully repaired and upgraded with new defensive systems designed to counter the kind of sophisticated threats they'd encountered during the attack. Major Indira Malhotra. The rank still felt strange, but she was beginning to accept that her career hadn't ended 3 years ago. It had simply been redirected towards something more important than personal glory. "Major," Captain Lisa Chen approached with a flight data card and the kind of nervous energy that characterized new combat pilots. "We're ready for the training mission. Four-ship formation, live fire exercise against simulated ground targets." Ghost accepted the data card and reviewed the mission parameters. Chen was one of 3 new pilots assigned to Bagram's close air support squadron, fresh from training and eager to prove themselves in combat operations. She reminded Ghost of herself 15 years ago, competent, confident, and completely unprepared for the psychological realities of warfare. "Captain, what's your understanding of tonight's training objectives?" Ghost asked, walking toward the ready room where the other pilots were waiting. "Close air support coordination with ground forces, tactical target engagement, and combat formation flying," Chen replied with textbook precision. "All correct, but there's a fourth objective you won't find in any manual." Ghost paused at the ready room door, "learning to live with the decisions you make under pressure." Inside, Captains Rodriguez and Williams were studying target photographs and discussing engagement angles. Both pilots had combat experience over Syria and Iraq, but Afghanistan presented unique challenges that required different tactical approaches. "Gentlemen," Ghost said, taking her position at the briefing podium, "tonight we're going to discuss something that doesn't appear in standard close air support doctrine. What happens when everything goes wrong?" She activated the briefing room's main display, showing gun camera footage from her engagement with the Wagner Group assault teams. The night vision imagery was grainy,